Well, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Emma Houston. It is 2:04 in the afternoon, and hopefully others will be joining us. But I just want to welcome you here to this Friday forum. Hear us breaking down systemic racism that impacts our communities. And we are able to utilize the chat if there's any questions or comments that you would like to put into the chat box while we are going through this conversation. I encourage you to do that as well. So we're just going to get started and begin this conversation on Hear Us, breaking down systemic racism that impacts our communities. Black and Indigenous people of color are calling in America in every possible way, in the streets, in the courts, in political campaigns, in city and state government offices, and in schools, using every possible platform and digital medium. What we have seen over the past few years, we have seen individuals come out in force to lend their voices, to lend their positions, and to lend their powers in how we are going to or need to break down systemic racism. So I am just going to start by introducing myself again. I am Emma Elizabeth Robertson Houston. I am the daughter of Ida Green and Norman Jean Robertson Sr. I am the granddaughter of Margaret Ledette and Louis Green Sr. and Faustina Henrietta and Emmett Robertson. And the reason that I introduce myself in that way, which can be extremely long at times, is I believe our names are not only important, but it ties us to our history and it carries our ancestors with us on our journey. So again, I am Emma Elizabeth and happy to be in this space with you this afternoon. If you were on the main stage earlier today, you also heard this information about our Indigenous land acknowledgement through the University of Utah and how we recognize that we are on sacred ground and that we owe this places that we call the United States of America to our native nations as well. So this information is usually shared whenever these type of presentations occur. One of the things that I want to share is that too often our culture views social problems through an individual lens. What did a person do to deserve his or her specific conditions or circumstances? But what we know that history and policies and culture and many other factors beyond individual choices have gotten us to where we are today. We just did not show up in these gaps and these disparities and these barriers that impact many of our communities of color. We are hoping to show that the existence of discrimination and racism by pointing out unequitable conditions is particularly important to tell the full story and how it links to our history, but also how it impacts our outcomes. And what the important link is that some audience can walk away believing that our healthcare and that our criminal justice or that our education system are by our own choices, the disparities that we encounter on a regular basis, that we somehow did something wrong. So this conversation today is going to begin to break down why we are in the space that we're in and how we can also lend our voice to correct some of the disparities that we are experiencing. So why are we here? And how to collectively disrupt cycles of inequality. When we think about all of the things that are going on in our community right now, when we talk about racial justice or social justice or economic justice. I was on a conversation last night with the Black community, and there were leaders talking about the disparities with the COVID vaccine. And one of the presenters, Reverend Dr. Oscar T. Moses, used an acronym called LIVE, L-I-V-E, to listen, to investigate, to value, but also to experience. And so when we're talking about injustices, we want to be able to understand the lived experiences, but also investigate what we are receiving as information, whether it's accurate information or inaccurate information. Also value the lived experiences of others as well. So when we're talking about racial justice, social justice, economic justice, we have to understand and listen, investigate, value, as well as experience and validate what those experiences are for individuals from underserved communities. General terms, we have an idea of what racial justice means, what social justice means, what economic justice means. We have an idea of what those definitions are and how they apply in the grand scheme of how we're interacting with others. But the four interrelated principles of social justice are equity, access, participation, and rights. And when we talk about what that looks like, I just want you to listen at some of the data. That Black students are suspended and expelled from school 3 times more often than white students. That the median wealth of white households is 20 times that of Black households and 18 times that of Latino households. And that 7 in 10 Blacks said that they are treated less fairly than whites are in their dealing with police officers. So when we think about just in these general terms, what does that look like and how does the data impact what racial justice, social justice, and economic justice looks like in communities that are underrepresented in the spaces that we live in? I'm going to leave this picture right here for just a moment. And what I'm going to ask you to do is just put a date to it. Just put a date to this individual picture and look at the words that are on the signs when we date this particular experience during this time frame. The words that are on the signs: we demand equal rights now. We demand integrated schools now. We demand decent housing now. We demand an end to police brutality now. So if you place the date on that, this is what I want you to look at right now. Right now. Different protests, different generations, same requests that we are experiencing during 2021. So looking at these 2 photographs that was on the previous screen and is on the screen right now, the question is simply as this: have we been informed? Have we been connected? Are we confused about how this happened in the 1950s? And here we are in 2021, and we are still demanding now equal rights and decent housing and an end to police brutality. But here we are in 2021, and side by side on the very same capitals of what took place in the Black and white photograph, but in the color photograph, what has taken place on the very same Capitol steps. And are we confused about the disparities that we see in these individual photographs? Are we looking at racial justice? Are we looking at social justice? Are we looking at economic justice? Are we saying that 2 different generations, 3 different generations, 4 to 5 generations from where we are now to what we are still demanding and how we are demanding this? So when we think about how do we listen, how do we investigate, how do we value, but also how do we experience the disparities on what we are experiencing right now with equality across the nation? So different contrasts, different demands, different populations. How can we see the disparities? How can we even see the similarities on the same Capitol grounds as what took place in the 50s, but what is now taking place in 2021? And how does that impact us individually, but as well as collectively? Are we more informed? Are we more connected? Are we confused about what is going on and what those demands are? Are we disconnected? Are we motivated? Are we engaged? Are we even angry about what is taking place? And the methods that are being used to ensure that we bridge the gaps, that we eliminate barriers, that we look at individuals as all of us as sisters and brothers, as people. And how do we define what equality looks like, what equity looks like, what fairness looks like when we're having such polar disconnect with how we engage in demanding equal rights and equal protection? And what does that look like in our own individual, but also our collective experiences? So let's talk about a historical perspective, a historical perspective. And one of the things that we are looking at is this: until the lions have their own historians, the history of the hunt will always glorify the hunter, will always glorify the hunter. So those previous pictures, 1950, and here we are in 2021, that is approximately a 71-year span. And we're talking about the same demands of equality and justice and being treated fairly. We are talking about who is writing the narrative and what that looks like, and how can we change the narrative so that we are an inclusive community, that we are an inclusive nation, that there is enough to go around for everyone to be successful, and that looks like. So until the lion have their own historians, the history of the hunt will always glorify the hunter. We pretty much know our history, and we also know that it has been sanitized. We also know that it has been not exactly necessarily complete with all of the disparities that we are still facing in 2021. So what does that historical perspective look like? Where did it all begin? What unfair laws and actions were imposed on communities of color? Like I said, we know our history, what we have been taught in our education system, what our parents, what our ancestors, what our great-grandparents have taught us, but do we know the complete history of why individuals from communities of color have had unfair laws and actions imposed upon them? We all know that enslaved individuals came across and was placed into what we now call the United States of America against their will. We know that portion of history. But when we talk about what it looks like and why there is mistrust with our police officers at this particular moment, we also know about slave patrols and how individuals who were once enslaved were returned and captured by individuals who were given the power to recapture individuals and return them to their owners. We also know about Jim Crow laws. We also know about the Board of Education with Brown versus the Board of Education. We know certain things happened in our history that is part of the trauma that we continue to relive based on how we are treated in society. So I asked you, are we aware of what is listed on this screen and the time frame that has separated between when we began to where we are now? So just to give you a little bit of background, in 1948, the military was integrated. That was only 73 years ago. In 1954, the schools were integrated. In 1964, the Civil Rights Act was shared across the nation. And then in 1965, Voting Rights Act, 1965, which is only 55 years ago. And then 1968, Fair Housing Act was also part of rights for individuals. So when we think about how we got where we are, there were rules, there were laws that were imposed on individuals who were from marginalized communities, who did not have the same rights that others, although they were imposed in the Constitution, we still did not have those same rights to move freely across this nation that we call the United States. So what do those inequities look like? We're talking about education, we're talking about housing, health, the judicial system, as well as economic wealth. And how do we narrow down the gaps that this looks like? So when we're talking about structural racism, is still seen through unequal housing and education and living conditions. We understand what redlining was all about, that when individuals who were Black or brown lived in a certain community, that banks and mortgage companies drew certain guidelines and sectioned them off to say in this particular area, loans and mortgages will not be approved because this is where the majority of Black and brown individuals live. And we all know that if you own a home, there is wealth attached to that. So we're talking about the inequities. We're talking about access to affordable healthcare. And when we look at what is happening with the COVID pandemic here in the state of Utah, 623,000 plus individuals in the state have been vaccinated. Of that 623,000, only 4,000 of Black individuals have received the vaccination. So when we think about access to health, we can just look right now from 2020 to 2021 and how that has impacted communities in the state of Utah. So early education and suspension stats. And the reason I'm sharing this data with you is that because we need to understand where this is leading to, how we got where we are, and how that has impacted us. So when we're looking at early education suspension stats, we know that what is going on within our schools, that it shows that our Black, brown, our indigenous individuals are suspended more, and what those percentages look like and how that impacts individuals. We also know that education is a road to moving out of poverty, to advancing ourselves, to getting quality jobs, but also getting access to health. So when we think about what that looks like within our education and school suspension, how does that impact our ability to navigate the spaces? How does it impact us to look at some systemic practices that are impacting us in a negative way? So on average, the economic wealth gap, on an average, Black households in the US with heads who have completed a college degree have less net worth than white households headed by someone with less than a college education. So when you think about that, when you're working into this economic wealth gap, and you're working and you've got this college education and you have all of the opportunities, still Black individuals are paid less than our white counterparts. And how does that look? How do we change that when we know that credentials play an important part in moving up in the wealth and eliminated those disparities as well? So this is a visual. This is what it looks like. Even those with less than a high school education, as far as Blacks are concerned, earn less. Those with a high school education, some with a college, some with advanced degrees still earn less than our white counterparts. And when we think about that, how does that impact the economy as a whole? How does that impact moving out of poverty? How does that impact in regards to leaving an inheritance for our children? So when we look at the disparities that are out there, how do we change these systemic practices that are part of the culture and the heritage that we engage in on a regular basis? And we think about, how did this even get started? So going back to historical perspective, everyone knows that when enslaved individuals were given their freedom, they were also promised 40 acres and a mule. And we know that if we own property, we can elevate ourselves to a next level. But unfortunately, that particular promise was not kept. And so individuals who were given the opportunity to elevate themselves were white slave owners. So thinking about that, how do we talk about elevating when we are still lagging behind based on our history and how this nation was built and how wealth was also built? I'm going to leave this photo up here for just a moment, and it has representation on here. And hopefully you all are able to identify who some of these individuals are. They are high profile individuals in the nation that we live in. They represent Fortune 500 companies. They are CEOs, they are directors of their boards, and representation matters. So of the 500 Fortune 500 companies, there are 4 Black CEOs of major 500 Fortune 500 organizations and corporations. So when we're talking about wealth disparities, what we talk about also is representation. And if I can see myself in this position, in these areas, then I can also aim myself and direct my ambition to also be able to be a representative in these areas as well. So when you think about 500 companies and only 4 are African Americans, how do we identify what those systemic barriers are that are eliminating individuals to reach those higher levels of wealth as well? So what does this cycle look like? What does this cycle look like? And how can we even identify what are some of the practices, what kind of discrimination is still going on? And how do we investigate any of this? How do we change this? How do we, as an organization, as a community, identify what took place in the past is still impacting what is going on currently in 2021? When you're looking at policing practices, when we're looking at the justice system, consumer credit practices, poor housing, we talked about redlining and how that still impacts communities that are sectioned in certain zip codes and how loans and mortgages are not approved based on your zip code. We know that tax base also it creates opportunities in our education system, and the wealthier tax bracket that you live in or the community that you live in, the more money is funneled toward our education system. What does voter suppression look like? We just came out of an election and we understand how voting makes a difference in the communities that we live in. So when we're looking at our history, we're looking at the transatlantic slave trade, we're looking at civil rights, we're looking at states' rights after the Civil War. We're also looking at the Emancipation Proclamation and how Jim Crow laws, even though enslaved people were given freedom, how also Jim Crow laws were impacted to restrict movement. But then we're talking about American city schools and segregation, but also how civil rights and how those protests help to eliminate and move forward some of those disparities that we are still encountering today. So does it matter? Does any of this matter? We're talking about systemic racism, institutional racism, but also we're talking about personal racism and how it impacts us, how we navigate this space, what it looks like in our institutions, what it looks like with our policies and our practices, but also the ripple effect that hundreds of years of discriminatory practices that favors the majority. What is it that we can do in our own institutions that if we recognize something that is a practice that is eliminating individuals from reaching their highest level of potential, how do we engage in those conversations? How do we say that these policies or these practices are is eliminating potential growth for individuals, but also the growth of an organization as well as a community? So biases and microaggressions, implicit and unconscious actions. What are the intersections? If I am a Black woman, if I identify a certain way, how do biases and microaggressions also eliminate my ability to navigate the space or to raise my professional development as well? So some people have a point felt that on the outside that they are unfairly excluded from something. And we understand that that happens, but do we understand that how it impacts an individual's lived experiences, but also how does it impact the organizations that we work with? So when we're talking about exclusionary practices, when we have these conversations, what is on the screen, individuals have felt that they have been excluded because of these individual labels here of gender identity, sexual orientation, age, religion, occupation, and language, that they have not had the opportunity to be coached, to be mentored, to be elevated to the next level, to be promoted because of their appearance or political affiliation, their place of birth. food preferences, social behaviors, or even their relationship statuses. So when we're talking about what does systemic practices looks like, if I am a hiring manager and I believe that individuals who fall in one of these labels are not going to be successful or not going to be able to elevate them to the next level, I, as a hiring manager, based on my biases, will not help coach or mentor or support or elevate someone to the next level. So when you look around the areas that you work in, whether professionally or personally, can you identify any exclusionary practices that are eliminating individuals from reaching their highest level of potential? And how can we utilize our positions, our privilege, our power to pull back some of these exclusionary practices and create a space of inclusion? So how do microaggressions and biases show up? What the intent is, but also what the impact is. And I am sure that we have been in spaces where there have been conversations and someone says, so where are you from? Although the intent may be, I want to get to know you better. If it's directed toward a person from a community for Black or Brown communities, it is implying that I am not I am not an American, that I do not belong in this space, that you think I am coming from somewhere else other than whether I live in Utah or Texas or Florida or whatever, I too am an American. So when we're talking about how these microaggressions shows up, how our biases show up and the impact that they have, I would caution us to begin conversations differently instead of what is, where are you from? And you are so articulate and there's only one race, the human race, because it impacts us in a negative way. And how can we change the conversation if we're wanting to get to know individuals? So what does it mean? And how to collectively disrupt cycles of inequality. When we're looking at our positions, when we're looking at our privilege, but also when we're looking at our power. If we're talking about our position, how does leadership opportunity show up for everyone who is wanting to elevate to the next level? How do I help mentor? How do I help coach? How do I help sponsor? How do I help develop someone who may have not had the opportunity based on my own individual biases? And what does that look like? But then how do our privileges come into play as well? And how do our power come into play? How are these manifested in our work environment or even on our college campuses or in our personal lives? And how and when do we show up in order to eliminate these practices that are creating barriers across the space? And I caution us always to look at what policies are in place right now, what hiring practices are in place right now. How do we live by individuals that when we talk about this is a barrier, how do we eliminate those barriers? How do we have those conversations? But also, how are we starting to build relationships so that we can navigate this space as well? And Anti-Racism by Dr. Ibram Kendi, one who is expressing the idea that racial groups are equal and none needs developing and is supporting policy that reduces racial inequity. It's one thing to talk about that we're going to eliminate these barriers. It's another thing to put into practice as to what that's going to look like. How we're going to show up in those spaces when we see some inequities that are going on. So what's happening in the whispers of organizations and in the halls of corporations? We all hear about disparities. We all hear about inequities. We all hear around what is going on and how everyone is not given the opportunity to reach their full level of potential and to bring all of their credentials to the spaces. My question is always this: although we may hear about it, what are we doing to change that behavior? How do we implement strategies that can raise the level of individuals of our organization? and the attitudes of our parents, of grandparents. Listen, I grew up in Dallas, Texas. Our parents taught us life lessons, what to do, what not to do, where to go, where not to go. Although they were not our lived experiences, they were our parents' lived experiences. So my question is always this, and the challenge is this: do we believe what we believe because we have experienced this? Or do we believe what we believe because we have been told to believe this? Are we going off history? Are we going off not knowing the experiences of others? Or are we going off what I have lived, what I have experienced, and how I have developed relationships as well? So when we think about the whispers in our organizations and in our halls of the corporations, what do we know that is practices that are unfair? But then again, what are we doing to ensure that we can change those practices? And are we willing to show up? What is it that we are willing to do? So Bishop Barber said, "It is time now, in memory of all those who died, those whose breaths were taken not by God, but by us, to work for justice, to work for love, and to work for mercy." So when we think about this, what is our commitment? We're talking about eliminating barriers that have systematic practices that are limiting individuals to reach their highest level of potential. Our call to action is always, what is our individual commitment and what are we willing to do? And how do these things matter to everyone every day? How do we link our mission? How do we link our purpose to creating a space that is successful for everyone, whether it's students, whether it's faculty, whether it's staff? How do we change behavior that's going to support an inclusive environment? How are we going to challenge authority when we recognize some inequities? How are we going to identify what our values are, but also what solutions may be? Meaning that when we're talking about what these components look like, what do we value in a society when we're talking about equity, we're talking about inclusivity, we're talking about justice, we're talking about belonging, we're talking about access. What does that mean in the fields that we're working in? And how can we eliminate those barriers? How can we begin those conversations? How can we start those building that relationship? How can we show up in all forms in order to help individuals who may be left on the sides as far as our Black and Brown communities, knowing that everyone has the very potential to be successful? What are we willing to do, and what does that look like? What does that sound like? What does that feel like? And are we willing to step out, knowing that we have the power to change the environments that we are in? So let's talk about this in regards to what does that even look like? And here are some 10 steps that I would like to recommend on how we move the needle. And identifying, am I going to be an actor in this space? Am I going to be an ally in this space? Or am I going to be an accomplice in this space? And by that, I mean, as an actor, I see things going on. I hear things that are happening. I see the disparities. I know that there are some barriers, there are some inequities. Am I just going to be an actor in this space because it doesn't impact me? It doesn't impact me. But if I am going to be an ally and I see and I hear and I know that there are some inequities, am I going to use my voice, my position, my power, my status to make changes, to bring to attention what those disparities looks like? But then again, as an accomplice, am I also going to walk hand in hand with individuals who have already voiced concerns about what these disparities look like? Am I also going to lend my voice, my position, my power into ensuring that what is being said is going to make changes? So we can be an actor in this space, we can be an ally in this space, or we can be an accomplice in this space. What we want to do is be in the space to make change happen, to move the needle, to ensure that everyone everyone has the opportunity to reach their highest level of potential, to be representative of the communities that we all serve, and to know that there is enough to go around, that we can sponsor, that we can coach, that we can mentor, that we can elevate all of us to our highest level. So knowing that we are going to acknowledge the experience and skills of others, we know individuals have the credentials, they have the background, they have the expertise to be in positions of influence. Are we going to acknowledge that and not make excuses? And are we going to contribute to the good of the organization? We know when there is diversity in a space, we know when exclusionary practices have been eliminated, that the organization rises to their highest level of competencies. Are we going to create opportunities for everyone? We know, I believe that it doesn't take anything away from me to help someone along the way, to help them with opportunities, to let them know opportunities that are available, that they have the skills, the ability to participate and to also apply. But we also need to do our work. Although there was a little historic perspective on the Black lived experience, we also have to do our own work. We have to know our history. We have to know our culture. We also have to know the struggles that communities have had to deal with going down this path of enlightening everyone. We also have to do our individual work by engaging with all people. It's not one thing for my 5 influences in my life to be African American women. My influences need to cross the gamut, needs to have individuals from all walks of life, from all lived experiences. And my question to you is this as well: who is your 5 influencers? Who from your individual, professional or personal, who are those that are in your life that you can have these conversations with, that come from different backgrounds, that come from different cultures, that come from lived experiences, that you can do a deep dive in when we're talking about disparities, when we're talking about inequities? Who from your circle of influence could you have conversations with? Identifying exclusionary practices and how to correct them. It's one thing for us to see them and not speak out upon them, but it's another thing for us to see them and to say something and come with strategies so that we can help elevate everyone. But also listen to understand. It's not for me to share my lived experiences, but for you to understand my lived experiences, but for us to understand what that looks like. It's not for us to validate anyone's lived experiences, for us to simply listen to understand that we all come from different paths and that what impacts one individual may not necessarily impact the other. Practice transparency. It's one thing for you to want to know and to build relationships with individuals, but also share with them why you want to learn, why you want to build relationships with them, why you want to create strategies that we can all benefit from. But also when you say something, say something. It is not our time to be silent anymore. We have been silent for so long, and we have unfortunately reached some of that silence in negative ways. But also stop being afraid to talk about race. It is in our face. We live it on a daily basis. We have to understand how it impacts individuals, but also how it eliminates the possibility for individuals to be successful. So my question to you always when we have these type of conversations is that we have had conversations. Now it is time for us to implement strategies, to identify some changes that we need to be concerned with, but also to be in a space and create space for others. So with that being said, it is 2:42 in the afternoon. I am happy to entertain questions or view some comments that may have been put in the chat box, and I will stop sharing at this time. Again, my name is Emma Houston. I'm the Special Assistant to the Vice President of Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion at the University of Utah. I appreciate you spending time in this space just to have conversation. Although I've done most of the talking, I am going to stop sharing and open up for any questions that you may have as well. There is chat. Is this a recorded breakout session? It is recorded, and happy to be here, and thank you. So if anyone would like to come off mute and ask a question or share a comment or a thought or share some strategies that you have implemented in regards to what does equity look like? What does belonging? What does access? What does success look like in the areas that you're working in, either personally or professionally? What have you found that has worked for you in this work that we talk about eliminating racism within our communities or within our work experience? Thoughts, comments, questions, suggestions, recommendations, lived experiences. Who's in your 5 influencers?
Hi, Emma. This is Megan.
I
I just wanted to thank you for your presentation. It was a great summary. It kind of has summarized many of the things I've read. Cisgender woman. The thing I find hard in Utah, I grew up in North Carolina, and I had friends of different races and colors, and here there are not as many people represented, and so it's like how to find people to talk with in a way that's genuine and not looking like, oh, I'm just trying to find a friend that looks different than me. I find that to be challenging. I don't know. I'm not looking to say you have the answer or anything. I don't know. I just think it's an interesting, it's a very different place to live. I lived in North Carolina. I've lived in Texas. I lived in Arizona. And I just find that to be a bit challenging.
Okay. Well, Ms. Megan, thank you for bringing that question, not only to me, but to those of us who are on this platform as well. May I recommend a couple of things? I get that question quite a bit. And as much as I would like to say that we are diverse as all of the other capital cities in our nation, that is not true. But places to go. If you Google Living Color Utah, livingcolorut.com, on this particular site, which is housed through Salt Lake City Mayor's office, it is a platform for our diverse communities. The Black Chamber lives there, the Pacific Islander Chamber lives there, our LGBTQ community lives there. There are chamber web pages under Living Color Utah, and you can find all of the activities that each of these communities produce, that they share, that they ripple out to the community for town hall meetings, for events. Although our events are limited at this particular moment, but you can find individuals from different backgrounds and find out what is happening in the community. Once you find that out, you simply show up. You simply show up either in these virtual settings or in the physical settings. Introduce yourself and start making those relationships. And it's genuine relationships that you are creating. So just knowing where to go to find that information, livingcolorutah.com is an excellent resource that you can utilize. Living Color Utah, livingcolorut.com is a great avenue to start working out in the communities and building relationships and being part of the conversation. So I'm happy to share that with you. Yes, Equality Utah, the Pride Center, absolutely wonderful groups. One of the things that you may also want to consider is the Greek fraternities. There are Black Greek sororities and fraternities, which are near and dear to my heart, that does information across the city and is very well known and respected in our community as well. But also the University of Utah, even if we connect with CESA, the Center for Ethnic Student Affairs, and our Black Culture Center and our Dream Center, and all of the centers that we have as resources on campus, even reaching out to what we have on campus would also be a resource that you can utilize with. Okay. Any other questions, thoughts, comments?
Hi, Emma. My name is Karen. Thank you so much for the presentation. That was really great. I feel like I want to share it with a lot of people that I know. One of the challenges that I'm kind of having now, and maybe this, I mean, we're seeing it in lots of places where people just don't seem to accept facts, right? So here's this great laid out, like, here's how systematic racism is, and here's what it's, you know, how it came to be. And I still have people that I know who are like, that's just flat out false. Like, you know, like that doesn't exist. And you said at one point that sometimes we put it on the people themselves, right? So I have people that I know who feel like it is Black people's fault that they can't climb out of the circumstances. And I really struggle when I come up against a person like that. I feel like it just shuts down the conversation. Like I have no way to sort of get the conversation started. Because what I want to say is something like, you know, are you living on another planet? So I don't know if you have suggestions of kind of how to start when you're coming from such opposing points of view, or if others have had experience with that.
Well, thank you, Ms. Karen. And I think the very important word that you used was facts. Absolutely is facts. And if we arm ourselves when we're having conversations with individuals for saying that's not true, you can go back to say, well, in 1965, the Civil Rights Act was created in order for individuals who were not given their freedom, who were not given their rights, in order to move forward. Brown versus Board of Education was given because individuals from Black communities were not given adequate opportunities for education. And these are information that is in our history. So when you come with facts, all you can do is meet people where they are and plant the seed. You simply plant the seed. We are not trying to change your thought process. We're trying to raise your awareness. And once you provide facts, they will either receive it or not receive it. But I believe that you have done your job, that you're still engaging in those conversations, and you want people to have correct information, and correct information is facts. So come armed with facts, simple as that. It's not for you to convince anyone, it's for you to raise people awareness. And if they want to receive it, they will receive it. But again, if they do not want to receive it, there's nothing you can do. But at least you have planted the seed, and for them to begin thinking about, maybe I was told that, and that's why I believe it, but I have not done my own work in order to do the research and get the facts as well. If anyone else would like to share that.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you, Ms. Karen. Thank you. Thoughts, questions, comments? Okay. Some people who I work with, mostly white men, don't believe that racism is real. That racism is real. There's a comment in the chat box that individuals do not believe that racism is real. All we have to do is turn on the television. All we have to do is look at our social media posts. All we have to do is look and see how individuals from different backgrounds, from different communities are treated unjustly. And when we think about, even if we look at education, even if we look at policing, how individuals from Black and Brown communities are treated in the policing system, but also treated in the justice system. This is not information that we are making up. This is information that is lived experience. So even though someone may not believe it exists, it's that they are coming from a lived experience of privilege, because I have to walk out my door every day and think how I may be encountered in the community. I'm not sure individuals who are not African-American, who are not Black women, think about when I walk out the door, when I go to the bank, when I go to the grocery store, when I stop at a department store. First of all, am I going to be treated with respect? But then again, am I going to be treated with disrespect? So sometimes we live in a space where our lived experience cannot relate to others whose lived experiences is something different. So even if you had a conversation to say, Emma, when you walk out the door on a daily basis, what is your major concern? And my major concern is basically that I will be treated fairly. I will absolutely be treated with respect. I will be treated fairly, not based on any negativity, any stereotype, any biases that someone has, that I will be treated as a person having an encounter with another person. Simple as that. So sometimes we do not think how others have to navigate this space. Thoughts, questions, comments, feedback?
So Emma, just to add to what you just said, I'm the one who made the comment in the feed about how many people don't believe that racism is real and that the problem's already been solved. But I had that same conversation with my mother when she says, well, I'm discriminated against all the time. My mother is white, I'm white. And so I used that same analogy with her. I said, Mom, when you walk out the front door in the morning, people don't know and they can't see your religion. But when someone of color walks out their door, they see something different and they judge people based on that. So those are big differences to me.
Absolutely. Well, thank you, Jan, for sharing that. And not to put any of us in a box, because listen, we are all individuals and we all have a lived experience. And we may have all experienced some discrimination or some racist act upon us. But the thing is that, like you said, when I walk out the door, regardless of how people are woke, regardless of how people are aware, I am a Black woman. And I will be treated differently based on who I encounter on that particular day. One of the things that I always try to do is make a verbal acknowledgement when I am in someone's space. I try to always greet them. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, acknowledge their space. There are times, and I want you to pay attention to this, when you are out in the community and you are shopping or you're in a space where there is customer service. If there is a person of color, I want you to just pay attention if that person is acknowledged, if that person is greeted, if that person is received with courtesy and respect. Just raise the awareness. And if the person in front of you, whether it would be me and I am not greeted, good afternoon, thank you for shopping with us. But if you are greeted when I leave, would you even notice that difference? Would you notice if the customer service person or the cashier or the clerk or whoever greeted you, but did not greet a person in front of you who may be from a different background? So the awareness is out there. And that may be a small awareness, but I just want you to just think about that the next time you're out in the community, and you may be in that space where you notice someone is not treated the same way you are treated, with courtesy and respect. That is a small indication. Thoughts, comments, questions? I see someone is going to another meeting. It is 2:56 in the afternoon. If there are no other questions or comments, I did put Arturo, yes.
Hi, good afternoon, Emma. Thank you for the amazing presentation.
Yes.
It was wonderful. Just wanted to touch on something you spoke about microaggressions, asking people where they're from. That is a funny thing. That is, the most awkward situation when someone asks you where you're from, and then you, excuse me, and then you tell them, oh, I grew up in so and such city, and then they ask you again, they're like, no, but where are you from? Like, it almost seems like it would be best if they just ask, like, what country or what, where are you originally from? And yeah, so it was funny that you touched base on that. It really resonated.
Well, thank you for sharing that. And usually when someone asks me that question, although I've been in Utah since 1986, I've been here, so I'm from Utah, although I'm from Texas. I say, you go first. You tell me where you're from. And they will pause, and they will chuckle, and they will say, well, really, I just want to get to know you better. I heard a Southern twang. I'm from Virginia, and I picked up on your twang. So it just all depends on what the intent is. Do you really want to get to know me? If that is the case, you go first. Tell me where you're from. And then if we want to do a deep dive in my history, my grandparents, my great-grandparents, then we can go there. But in the meantime, tell me where you're from, and then we can begin the conversation.
I love that. Thank you for the feedback.
You're welcome. You're welcome. Cassidy, you came off mute. Do you have a comment, question, suggestion? Okay. Well, thank you all so very much. I appreciate you spending a little time. And hopefully, if you see something, you will say something. We all have to show up in the space and hold space for others as well.